So, my research topic had to do with the first wave feminist movement, specifically in New York. So, the three articles I chose to read on JSTOR had to do with the intersectional foundations of the movement, along with some of the varied political beliefs in the movement. So, the first article I read was by Joe Miller, and it was called Never a Fight of Women Against Man: What Textbooks Don't Say About Women's Suffrage. In the article, Joe Miller discusses the contemporary historical memory of women's suffrage. He argues that the underlying message of most modern day instruction about the women's suffrage movement pits women against men rather than open minded people against closed minded people. Miller opens his article by discussing the paradox of women's rights movement leaders opposing women's suffrage and asserts that some of these anti suffragettes believe that women could achieve more power in society without the vote, and that these anti suffragists did not want women to rely on the clumsy political methods of men. By discussing the opposition to women's suffrage, it would contribute to the very broad conversation about first wave feminism. Now, when I examined most of Miller's sources, I found that many of his sources were within the broad feminist historian context. So some of his most important primary sources included History of Women's Suffrage by Susan B. Anthony and selected speeches from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. His other sources, however, include works about the anti-suffragist movement, like Women May Decide the Suffrage Question, which was an article by the New York Times written in 1910. The second article I read was called Votes for Women: Race, Gender, and W.E.D. Du Bois's Advocacy of Women's Suffrage. So, in this article, Valencia Watkins discusses the role of race and gender in women's suffrage. More specifically, she discusses the feminist views of black rights activists like W.E.D. Du Bois and his succession to Frederick Douglass in the movement. This article is especially relevant in contemporary times because many historians are exploring identical intersectionality regarding social issues like abolition and women's suffrage. According to Watkins, Du Bois was a staunch advocate of universal women's suffrage and offered many biting critiques of racism within the suffragist movement. Watkins did not include many primary sources in her bibliography, but she did have many secondary sources that were relevant to her chosen area of research, like Daughters of Jefferson, Daughters of Bootblacks, Racism in American Feminism, and Frederick Douglass on Women's Rights. The last article I read was called Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Reformer to Revolutionary, A Theological Trajectory. Now, this article touches upon the theological roots of feminism. More specifically, Jan Stevenson Mosner explains how the Christian religious beliefs of Elizabeth Cady Stanton changed over time and affected her beliefs about the women's rights movement. According to the author, Elizabeth Cady Stanton started out as a really fervent Christian religious reformer, and by the end of her life, I wouldn't necessarily classify her as a Christian, because she believed that Christianity and the American law system were founded upon the idea that women were made for men. Thereby, she believed that it required revolutionary acts to uproot the whole system so that the rights of women might be given to them. The author also used relevant primary and secondary sources in their article, like the spiritual crisis of the Gilded Age and the evangelical roots of feminism. All three articles that I chose related to the wide variety of foundations of the first wave feminist movement, which included anti-suffragists, the relationship between race and feminism, as well as the evangelical roots of feminism.